Check out where ideas they thrive, thought find depth, and every conversation explores the art of thinking beyond the obvious. And today I have my special guest. He's a sci fi and historical fiction author, a podcast host as well, and audiobook producer, none other than Mr. Henry Sullivan III.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Mr. Henry, once again to my one of my podcasts. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I missed?
Let's see. On your other podcast, I mentioned that I grew up in New Orleans and that
Mm-hmm.
I'm living in New York now, that I've lived in several other states. I guess the thing that's probably relevant to this conversation is that, because I don't remember if I mentioned it, growing up, I went to a Catholic elementary school, a Catholic high school, and a Catholic university.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now my family wasn't Catholic, so I also went to a Baptist church on Sundays until I was about 17, when I was given the choice as to whether I wanted to go. Um, and so that amount of exposure to Christianity specifically was one of the reasons why I was so comfortable writing Colosseum.
Yes, and interesting, Mr. Henry, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. And today, let's talk about writing LGBTQ plus characters as an ally. So, beyond diversity points, what compelled you to include LGBTQ plus characters in your stories in a meaningful way rather than as a checkbox?
So I did mention in the other podcast that, because you asked me about the process of how does the story come to me, what comes
Yes.
first, what comes second. So I mentioned that the idea usually comes first, and in the case of Colosseum, and I got the idea actually 10 years ago, and the only thing I had at the time was this idea of a television show where you had combatants on one side who were represented the Confederacy, and combatants on the other side who represented the United States of America, and that they would battle it out. And I knew that that type of entertainment would be appealing to to a uh, a serial killer because it's very violent. And so I also knew that there would be a serial killer in the story, which also meant that there had to be people trying to find the serial killer. So some kind of law enforcement. And at that time, I only had one character, and that was Smiling Jack, the TV producer. But as I explained in the other podcast, I didn't really have a story for Smiling Jack or any of the other characters. So 10 years later, the characters started to come to me, including Victoria Morales, which is the transgender character in the story. Um, and like I explained, I mean, my characters kind of come to me all complete. I don't make them up as I go along. It's usually I'll think of Smiling Jack. I knew what he looked like. I knew what kind of personality he had. I just didn't have a story for him. And the same thing is true of Vicky and Blake and Susan and the other characters in the novel.
Interesting. Mr. Henry, the ally as an a straight point. As an ally, what did you identify as the most crucial thing you need to learn before you felt prepared to write a LGBTQ plus character authentically?
I think really for me, I was comfortable writing Vicky after I realized that the question, what is a woman, is not actually a question. What it is it's an attempt to impose a framework on you that you don't have to accept. So it's kind of a trick, you know? And
Mm.
once I understood that, that's when I was pretty comfortable that I could, develop all these, different characters and do justice to them, make them authentic.
Authenticity, people, authenticity indeed. And the why now? How do you respond to the question, why did you make this character LGBTQ plus when it is asked with skepticism?
Well, I mean, it's I understand the question, but at the same time, why do you make characters, heterosexual? Why do you
Mm-hmm.
make characters male?
Mm-hmm.
Um, why did you make this character a cop and that character a criminal? Because as I said, the characters really just kind of came to me, and my cast of characters are always diverse, which is the reason why my audiobooks always have a full cast, because I don't really write stories that where it's in a small town and most of the characters are all kind of the same. I don't really write those kind of stories. My stories always have very diverse casts dealing with the complexity of and the social dynamics that you encounter when you have people coming from different points of view.
Mr. Henry, the character first principle. How do you ensure a character's LGBTQ plus identity is woven into their personality and journey rather than being their sole defining trait?
Well, I do it the same way I do it with the characters who are not LGBTQ. So if the character has a love interest or if the character encounters someone that it feels right that they would have a certain amount of attraction, the tension that comes from being attracted to someone but not exactly knowing if that attraction is reciprocal, um, then I just write it naturally. I don't try to force anything. Um, and I guess I should say uh, I've been in a really wide variety of situations. I mean, I've worked all over the country. I worked with a really wide variety of people. Um, and most of my jobs have been some form of customer service. That's the other thing. So, in addition to having a wide variety of coworkers, I've had to deal with a lot of different kinds of people. And so there's just a certain kind of especially when you're in big cities like Chicago, New York, Atlanta, um, there are ways that people interact in situations where you're used to dealing with people from different backgrounds or even people who are not even from the area, that feel natural. And then there are ways where you could force it. It kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of black exploitation movies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're familiar
Yes.
with that idea? Okay.
Yes.
So that was the problem with black exploitation movies is it didn't actually reflect probably the experience of the people who made the movies. They lived in diverse communities,
Mm-hmm.
but they knew that their movies were being broadcast to the whole country, and they knew that there were parts of the country that didn't want to see what they knew to be true. And so what they did is they kind of created these caricatures of people to appeal, caricatures that would appeal to people outside of their situation, a diverse situation. And so it's like understanding the difference between that and how people just naturally interact is how I kind of operate.
Yes, Mr. Henry, just give me a minute. Okay. Balancing universal and specific, Mr. Henry. When writing on LGBTQ plus character, how do you strike a balance between their universally relatable human experience and the specific unique realities of their identity?
Well, one way to do it actually is not to avoid it. And by that I mean a lot of times, again, going back to my own personal experiences, one way that people kind of deal with differences is they actually like put it on the table and bring it out. So somebody might say, I'm not doing this because of X, is a way of addressing their feeling that the other person is assuming that their motive is X. And so you can actually have the characters do that. Um, and since I've seen people do it in real life, I feel pretty comfortable having my characters do it in the story, and it doesn't feel like I'm trying to speak through their voices, trying to kind of preach or trying to give like uh some kind of uh philosophy or parable or something like that. I'm just having them interact naturally, you know. So that's one way to do it. Another way is, I think I mentioned in the other podcast, that for me the most difficult layer to add to a story is exposition, where you
Mm,
actually create the context, and that's usually after you've done all this setup. You've introduced the scene, you've introduced the characters, you kind of introduce the inciting incident, the characters sort of interacting with each other, and then there's a moment when, as an author, you can sort of expose an insight about all of that in like one very efficiently written sentence. Um, and so that's another way to do it, going from the universal to the specific.
let's talk about the research versus assumption. What does your research process look like, and how do you move beyond stereotypes and actively seek out authentic voices and live experiences?
Well, I think my own personal experiences make it kind of give me an advantage in terms of kind of knowing how people talk, uh, and what is sort of what feels realistic, given the combination of people that you have in a situation, and what the situation is, what someone will say or not say. And I also, my writing groups tend to be diverse as well, and so I'm getting different perspectives, not only different perspectives on the approach of writing or writing preferences and stuff like that, but also just different perspectives on life. I mean, um, you know, and I sometimes I accept that and sometimes I don't. I mean, I have I collaborate with some writers. There's one in particular that I'm thinking of. Her preference is kind of uh the idealized kind of situation where, when you have a conflict, the conflict resolution kind of tells it advocates for a particular philosophy. So I'm thinking in terms of To Kill a Mockingbird. Like whenever she kind of gives me this feedback, because my stories tend to be more. I'm not trying to preach to you in terms of the way things should be. What I'm doing is I'm showing you how things actually are. And she oftentimes, this particular writer will give me the feedback. Well, why didn't one of the characters say this is wrong? And I'm like, well, have you ever been in a situation like that where somebody said it was wrong other than you? And her answer is, well, no, that's the reason why I say it. And I'm like, well, you're the exception, you're not the rule. And it's not like you're the only person. It's just that in a lot of situations, people will not admonish folks on the basis of a particular expectation of how things should be. What they'll do is they just sort of deal with it. They may make a point to try and do what they think should be done in their personal lives, and when they have to make the decision. But when they're in a situation where other people are not making the right decision, a lot of times people just won't say anything. Or if they say something, they'll complain behind the person's back. Um, Whereas this other writer always wants me to have a character kind of say, well, that's wrong. And these are situations where I know for a fact, I mean, a lot of times I may have watered down what I actually witnessed. and nobody said anything. So but but still, I kind of consider that to be an example of a diverse opinion. She has a different opinion from my opinion. She has a different cultural background than I do, and has had a different experience. So I take all that into account, and I guess I'm fortunate that I've dealt with a lot of different kinds of people.
Mr. Henry, how do you approach the concept of coming out in your narratives? Do you feel a responsibility to include it or subvert it or move beyond it entirely?
Well, I haven't written a scenario where any of my characters have had to come out because in most of my environments, the characters aren't th- their issue isn't that type of pressure. So I mean, when I worked in the restaurant industry, no one had to come out because everybody knew like where everyone came from because that particular environment was accepting, and didn't really judge on the basis of that. They judged on the basis of whether you came to work on time or whether you called off or whether or not you tried to steal somebody else's tips or something like that. That's what they judged you on. And I tend to write a lot of environments like that where those aren't really the issues among the characters, and so the characters don't really need to come out necessarily. Um, but I have had characters like have to confront other issues, like in Coliseum. Um, Vicky is investigating a crime along with other investigators who are much more conservative than she is. But then again, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And so there's a certain amount of professionalism. And so even though as the reader that these two characters probably would disagree on these issues, but given the environment that they're working in and the social mores of that organization is not really going to come up except for in the characters' heads. And so that's another situation where she doesn't have to necessarily come out, because the FBI director, who's very conservative, would never kind of create a situation where he's going to force her to.
Mr. Henry, how mindful are you of the specific language, slang, or cultural references used by and about LGBTQ plus communities? How do you incorporate these respectfully?
Well, the way that I address that is I do not use disrespectful language in the exposition or the narration or the prose. Um, Whereas, I do have people speak the way people speak, as a way of forcing the story to go into a direction where you have to confront these issues. I mean, if people don't at some point say what they're actually thinking, and like I said, in the FBI, that's probably not going to happen. But if two characters are just out in public and one person encounters another, then there is a chance that one of the people is going to say something, offensive. So I don't have it in the actual prose, so the world, but I will put it in the situation in the dialogue if the dialogue calls for that.
Internalized narratives, Mr. Henry. How do we write the complex and sometimes painful internal landscapes like internalized homophobia or transphobia with empathy but without trauma and exploitation?
Well, that is that's a very complicated issue. I mean, that's a really good question. Uh, I'm trying to think of situations because another thing is I try not to make any of the characters like idealistic. So in other words, Vicky has faults just like everybody else. And so even though of course she's not going to make uh, uh, gender and sexual orientation biases. She's not going to think those things, but she will think necessarily. I do have her because she has a coworker who is Saudi Arabian, and so there are, and she's never dealt with someone from Saudi Arabia, and so there are issues that, things that she thinks that she's not necessarily going to say to this character. um and so, I just, these are issues that I want to explore, and so I do deal with those issues, and I try to be as, authentic, careful, realistic, as I possibly can.
The line between the ally and the voice, Mr. Henry, do you ever worry about taking up space or speaking for community? How do position you work as an ally author?
Well, I mean, to your question about do I ever worry about taking up space or speaking on behalf of community, I
Hmm.
totally understand if someone feels that way because I have had that feeling myself when it comes to when I've read or seen works where the uh, the the artist is, their intent is to speak on behalf of black men, for instance. Um, and I mean, it's not that I'm not necessarily angry or offended by it, but at the same time, I kind of feel like, well, I don't feel like I'm spoken for. So maybe that was your intention, but I don't necessarily feel spoken for. So I totally understand that someone might feel that way, for my characters, and that, yeah, it just happens. That's not my intent, though. I'm not trying to speak for anybody. I guess the way that the way that I deal with it is, like I said, I always have a wide variety of characters in my story. So you don't read any of my stories and feel like I'm speaking from anyone in particular because there's so many different people coming from different points of view.
Mr. Henry, how do you decide whether to write a story, whether the character's identity is a central to the conflict or one where it's simply a normalized part of their world?
I guess I always write the former though. I always write stories where the identity is central to the conflict. Um, so I guess the only other thing that I balance it out with the characters have other things about them, and so they may have, there's a job that they have. They're like they might have kids or responsibility, and so but there's usually a main identity that is kind of constantly at play and being sort of explored, uh, uh, as this character's interacting with all these other characters. But no one has one identity really. I mean, they're, like Vicky has several identities. She's also acting as a mom. She's a professional working for the Department of Homeland Security. She's new to the community that she's moved into, so she has multiple identities. Um, I guess I'm just trying to say that that's the way I handle it.
Let's talk about the legacy of bad representation of Mr. Henry. When writing, are you in conversation with LGBTQ plus representation you consume in the past? How does it influence your choices?
Well, the answer to your question is yes. I mean, a lot of the books that I read include the same kind of diversity that I just spoke of. It's not necessarily in, because I write my stories all happen in the United States of America. So that's the geographic boundary that I'm dealing with, but they occur all over the United States of America, not in one state or the other. Um, it's interesting that you the second part of your question, because one novel that I read that also kind of gave me this confidence, like, oh, I like the way that this particular writer handled this character, The title is The Perfect World of Miwaku Sumida by Clarissa Gonewan, Goenawan. And I really like the way she wrote that character, that story, because she kind of gave all of the characters their due, and didn't force anything in there. And I felt like even though the story took place in another country, that that there was a lot of balance in the way that she portrayed the culture, and familial ties and so on, without sacrificing the tension in the story. So that for me was an example of what I tried to do in Coliseum. That for me, it was an example of doing the same thing well.
Mr. Henry, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in sixth season, abstract poetry in third season, and my book 101 review in sixth season too. Comedy 101 in third season, and my food 101 in sixth season as well. Geography 101 love letters, movie 101 reviews, and Music 101 a fourth season, and Science 101, Sex 101 a third season, and My Baby Podcast, Mental Health 101, Law 101, Bible Verses 101, and Entrepreneurship 101, and newest one, Motivation 101. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So, Mr. Henry, tell us for the last question that I have: what is the emotional or intellectual impact you hope your LGBTQ plus characters have on all of your readers, both inside and outside the community?
The confidence to be yourself. I mean, that's the main thing. I guess that's the reason why I write diverse stories with diverse casts, is because I feel like it's really important to just feel comfortable in your own skin. Um, and so all of my characters actually feel comfortable in their own skin. That's not a flaw that they have. I know some people. I've interacted with writers where the way that they try to make the characters relatable is they make them sort of insecure, or kind of hesitant or afraid, where they're constantly doubting themselves. Um, and I don't actually write characters like that. My characters, my characters are very confident. Um, so if anything, I'll have a character who might be confident to a fault, if anything. Um, but I just believe I just believe that it's good for people to feel comfortable in their own skin.
Mr. Henry Sullivan III, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Thank you. Yes, yes. I mean, I've mentioned Colosseum. Another book that my next bestseller is Escape from New Orleans. Then after that, Dinner Invitation. Those are also pretty easy audiobooks to find wherever you listen to music and podcasts. If you search Henry Sullivan III, Coliseum, or Escape from New Orleans, or Dinner Invitation, you'll probably find it. It's available on dozens of platforms.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Henry Sullivan III, because if you support him, for sure more and more empowering books like this to rise. So, Mr. Henry, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Marika people, see you soon.